You know, we've seen a lot of switch design up to this point. And if you're like me, you're probably thinking, this is awesome. I'm so ready to jump in. So what do I buy? And that's what we're going to talk about. By the time you're done here, you will be able to select a switch vendor and a model for your company and lab environment. Now, I want to make sure I address something before we go any further, because I'm sure some of you read that "you will" statement and thought to yourself, well, that's just great. I don't have a company to buy switches for. Or more specifically, I don't have a company to buy switches for me. And that's totally fine, because whether you're learning this technology in your home or in your office, the technology works the same. And at the end of this nugget, I'm actually going to give you a recommendation for a switch lab environment that you can get really inexpensive. This is a picture of me in my early 20s. Had to be really early 20s because I wasn't married yet, which also explains why I could drill holes in the wall like that without any ramification. Now, I can say this is probably before I got into network technology, because once I did get into network tech, I mounted a 2-post rack in that corner and slowly filled it with network equipment over the years. I was probably learning server stuff right here. I'm guessing that CD is a Windows Server 2000 CD where I installed some web server and tried to host it from home, or a file share or printer server or who knows what. The point is that this was my LAN to play and break stuff. I can tell you conclusively, before I ever roll out something really cool to the enterprise, it starts in my house as some fun home tech. Before I ever set up a business wireless network, I put a wireless access point in my house. Before I ever implemented my first IP telephony system, I was calling from room to room. Before IP surveillance was a reality in the enterprise, I implemented it as an IP fish camera to watch my saltwater fish tank. Or once I had kids, an IP baby cam. My whole point in all of this is, as you do this, you should really start loving what you do. IT is a blast. Even as I give you those few examples, my mind is like, oh yeah, and then there's so many things that just started as a fun idea. The fact is, the more you love what you do, the better you're going to be at it. So with that, let me then transition into the big picture of switching equipment. What brand should you use? My family recently outgrew our minivan. I know some of you are like, how do you outgrow a minivan? You just keep having kids. And there's this certain genre of SUV. It's actually a 9-passenger SUV before you have to graduate to those big scary white vans that you see down by the river. So there's 3 different types of 9-passenger SUVs: a Chevy Suburban, Tahoe, and a GMC Yukon. And as I've shopped those 3 brands, I've noticed that they're all really the same thing with a couple tweaks. One might be offered in blue, one might be a little bit longer, one might have leather seats instead of cloth seats. You get the idea, right? Well, it can be somewhat the same with switch manufacturers, with a couple exceptions. First off, you'll see that I've divided this between 2 different genres: small and mid-sized business and large and enterprise business. You'll also see that both lists start their way with Cisco and then drop down to what I would call everybody else. The fact is, nobody ever gets fired for choosing Cisco as their switch manufacturer. They not only lead the industry, they literally dominate the world of networking. And it's because they are so massive that these other vendors have found their way in by filling a unique niche. For example, HP got a pretty strong foothold in the small/mid-size market by offering some pretty good equipment with a no questions asked lifetime warranty. Literally, the HP switch could die 10 years later and they would replace it at no cost. They also offered it at a price far below Cisco enterprise grade equipment. And they made their operating system very similar to the Cisco operating system, so someone transitioning wouldn't have that much to learn. And thus, HP is now a pretty substantial player in both the small, mid-size, and the large enterprise market. Ubiquiti got their foothold by offering long-range wireless equipment. I mean, the kind of stuff that shoots your wireless signal many miles or kilometers at insane level pricing. I mean, stuff that costs tens of thousands of dollars you could get for a couple $100. And it worked really good. And so Ubiquiti took what they started with long-range Wi-Fi and spread it to in-house Wi-Fi along with routers and switches, all while maintaining that disruptive pricing model. So now they've become a player in the market. Now you can see at the very bottom of this list, I grouped just a big lump of vendors. I don't like these guys. And I know many of you are like, but what about Netgear? I have a Netgear. Netgear is a very big player in the small mid-size space. But the reason I've grouped them with this lump of vendors is because on 3 different occasions over long ranges of time, I've had their devices freeze on me. I mean, literally lock up. Hard reboot is the only thing that brings it back online. Now, if you're new to networking, you might think, well, that's not so bad. You have to reboot Windows computers all the time, right? Oh, such a big difference between a Windows computer and a device that powers the very fabric of IT at your organization. When I see network devices do a hard freeze that needs a power cycle to bring it back time and time again, I immediately think it doesn't matter how cheap you are. It's not worth it. Guys, I can tell you there have been times where I've been at data centers at 2:30 in the morning praying for network equipment to come back online. There's nothing that can compare to the stress that you feel when hundreds, if not thousands of people are all looking at you, be it virtually, with such disdain because in their eyes, you caused them to lose their work. You caused them to be unproductive at this very moment. So when I see a device do a hard freeze, you go into the junk pile at the bottom of my list. But that's also one of the big difference between these grades of equipment and these grades. Can I show you something? Let's do a quick Google search for a Cisco SG300 28P. This is one of those switches that I would group into the small business / mid-size business grade. Look at those prices, $682, $500, $699. So let's change that to an enterprise grade, Cisco 3850. Wowzers. You see the price jump to $3210 or $5,495 or $13,500 from serversupply.com. Now, first off, why such wild price differences? Well, it's probably because of software feature differences. You'll see different versions of software that Cisco creates that deliver different features at different price points. Second off, this line of equipment is designed for the enterprise. If Intel has a 48-port switch that fails, that means that about 48 people with very high salaries stop working for anywhere from 1 to 4 hours. So when you look at that price difference between a $600 switch and a $2,800 switch, Intel is more than happy to pay $2,200 price difference for a switch that's designed to just never fail. Ever. I know that sounds crazy, but I've dealt with a lot of Cisco equipment over the years, and I have stuff that's more than 15 years old that's still running. So let me sum up that last conversation simply by saying you can't go wrong buying Cisco equipment. However, in the world we live in today, there are a lot of other manufacturers with some pretty compelling offering. So much so that you might look at it and say, I want that for my house. And you know that's where it all begins. So let's talk about the key features that you should get on the switching equipment that you buy. Because I fully expect once you're done with this nugget that you will land on Google and start putting together an amazing list of lab equipment. First and foremost, managed switch only. On the small mid-sized business side, you'll probably see more switches managed by a graphic user interface like a web browser. And as you move towards the enterprise grade equipment, you'll see stuff that is primarily managed by Telnet and SSH. In a nutshell, CLI management. And that's usually because as you graduate to that level of equipment, you have people that's all they do. So they really harness the power of using command line based equipment. Now in modern networks, you only want to get equipment that is 1,000 megabits per second or essentially 1 gigabit per second or faster, ideally having 10 gigabit per second uplinks. And that would be used to connect your switches. So you have your switches connected like this, feeding all your users. Those are 1G links. And the links between your switches are 10G. If you're using these as only a lab environment, then 100 megabits per second will work fine all day, and you can really get some amazing stuff super cheap if it only runs at 100 megabits per second. And I'm talking that $3,000-$4,000 enterprise grade switch for $20. Now you may want to look for a switch with GBIC or SFP slots. These are essentially two acronyms that mean the same thing. They are slots or ports that have modules that can be changed out. Now, the switch won't come with any modules. That's where you buy these small form pluggable modules. And usually these deal with fiber optic cable. Not always, but most of the time, if you want to add fiber optic cabling to a switch to connect switches together over a long distance, or that needs a really high capacity, you'll use fiber optic cable. Since there's different kinds of fiber that you can get, they make different modules that fit each fiber type. Ooh, and that also makes me think of something. More recently, they've come out with these things known as DAC cables. Let's go to Google, DAC cables. And right there is one. These are cables that are designed to go in those GBIC or SFP ports that have the cable pre-soldered into it. That way you don't have to figure out what kind of fiber to use or worry about a cable coming disconnected. It's all one unit. Now, a lot of times you'll find these things are proprietary, like to connect two Cisco switches together or an HP server to an HP switch. DAC cables are usually shorter cables and used to connect devices in the same rack together. You'll want to get a switch that has VLAN support, and that allows you to divide your switch into multiple switches. We'll talk a lot about VLANs later on in this series. You'll want one that has port security, and that gives you the ability to limit what devices or how many devices can plug into a single switch port. You'll definitely want spanning tree. You'll definitely want lag capabilities. We talked a lot about those previously. Ideally, unless you're doing this just in a lab environment, you want it to be rack mountable. For example, this switch right here is a Cisco SG300 10-port switch. An amazing lab switch. However, if you were to try and stick that into a rack, it would look something like that, floating in the middle. Now, they make brackets that can actually fill the gap, these long bunny ears that go on the side of this thing, but you usually have to buy them separately. Almost always, you'll want a switch that has PoE support. That's power over Ethernet to power wireless access points, IP cameras, and IP phones that plug into the switch. SNMP allows you to monitor the switch. It stands for the Simple Network Management Protocol. It lets your monitoring system peer into the different components of that switch, its processor, its interface, the bandwidth it's using, all of that, so you can make sure all is well. Cisco Discovery Protocol and Link Layer Discovery Protocol, two things that do the same exact thing, one proprietary to Cisco. They allow you to see what network devices are directly connected to your switch. These are an awesome feature if you're trying to build a network diagram from a remote location and you can't physically see what's connected to what. Now I'll mention the bonus feature at the very end, layer 3 switching. Actually, the Cisco SG300 10-port has this feature. It allows the switch to be a router. We're not going to do much of that in this series, if at all, but it's a really cool feature to have when you graduate to larger switch networks. The last thing to consider is the size of switch that you're going to get. Now, I'm sure your eyes have immediately drawn to there and you're thinking, Jeremy, why is that switch on fire? Well, because I want to make sure that you remember as we talk about sizes of switch, there's a type of switch, and I should say more specifically, a type of placement of a switch that causes far more harm than good. And that's when you have somebody that has maybe a single port in their cubicle and they say, oh, well, I want 2 devices. The right thing to do is to get management approval and run a second cable to that person's cubicle. Don't stick a small switch, like this one on fire, in their cubicle. That's not a network design. That's just a quick reaction to trying to solve an immediate need. Having a network chock full of these things will cause you to go up in flames. Now this, and this represents what I call stackable switches. And I've got to be careful using that term nowadays because it overlaps with this technology. When I say stackable switch, I'm talking about a 10-port or a 24-port or a 48-port switch that is individually managed and mounted in a rack of equipment. This is a relatively new kind of technology that Cisco originally pioneered, and they called it EtherStack. Now, the branding has since changed and every vendor has their own word for this, but what it allows you to do is to connect these switches together in the back, and it literally combines the back plane of the switch. Meaning you don't actually have to connect the switches via Ethernet cables anymore because these individual switches now act as one. In addition to that, you manage them as one. No longer do I have to log into this top switch and configure it for various settings and spanning tree configurations. I log into this stack of switches as a whole and manage it as one entity. You can think of it as this stair step to get you to the chassis-based switch. So down at the bottom of the stairs, you have individual switches, which are like these. You slowly grow into a stack of switches, like these, and then you grow into the chassis-based switches, or some people call those modular switches, like these. Now, this is a fairly small modular switch, but you can see right here are the modules. You can slide those trays out and slide in different trays to give it different port types and different capabilities. The beauty of the chassis-based switch is look at that. Oh, and that. Redundant power supplies. And that. Redundant fan trays. There's one on this side you can't see. I think this even has a headphone jack. Actually, I have no idea what that port is. The beauty of this switch is it's built like a tank. If you're looking for something that has a maximum uptime, this is the way to go. If I Google chassis switch, you can see these things come in all shapes and sizes. And most of your expense is not going to be in the chassis itself. It's going to be in the individual modules that you slide inside of that switch. Now, before you go buy one of these bad boys for your lab environment, because you can get the older ones pretty cheap, do know that they sound like a small jet on liftoff. If you're an unmarried guy or gal, you might find that noise comforting. However, if you have a spouse, it can cause some disruption. Now, I promised that you would be able to select a switch vendor and a model for your company and lab environment. So here's what I want you to do. Select at least 4 switches to use in a lab or production environment to have on hand through the rest of this series. Jeremy's suggested switch models is over here on the side border. And I'm providing these suggestions as of June 6, 2017. There's so much I want to say right now, I have to keep myself from exploding. First off, the reason I put the date is because this list will change over time. Network equipment comes and goes. And I will also tell you, it took me about an hour to put together this list of equipment. And I know what I'm looking for. Honestly, as part of this practical exercise, I want you to do some homework. And based on this list of features, find stuff that fits what you're looking for. There's an old saying that says, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Rather than just grabbing a few of the switches that I've listed over here, I'd much rather you come back to this key feature slide and start Googling away. Stuff like small PoE switch. And you go, ooh, unmanaged. I'd rather have a small managed PoE switch. Netgear, ugh. Oh, there we go. Amazon Cisco SF324P. $269. What? Let's try eBay. SF324P. There we go. That's a little better. Or maybe you start with my list and dig around. Some of these switches aren't even made anymore. So you know those are going to be a lot cheaper. ProCurve 2626. Look at that. 2 of them for $40. You see what I mean? I kind of want you to get lost for a little while. Give yourself an hour to play around, Googling away. If you're brand new just getting into this, I would suggest getting all the same brand. And to stick with these guys, meaning the Cisco SF or SG series, or any of these guys down here. The reason I say that is because these guys have a strong graphic interface as well as a command line. So you get a lot of point and click configurations that are easy to get started with, but you have the power of command prompts if you need it. If you're a little more experienced, you might grab a mix of equipment. Grab some stuff from different vendors. Things like Spanning Tree Protocol or LLDP are all industry standard protocols. They will work across a variety of switch manufacturers. The experience is going to come in trying to figure out how to do it on the different operating systems.